You took us back more than 40 years and talked about the GOP's long-term strategy to build a Christian coalition. You said progressives need to do the same thing, but do it opposite. What does that look like in your view?
Again, it's about values. The Christian coalition essentially decoupled government from the lives of the people. And Trey quoted it, but "Hi, I'm from the government. I'm here to help" is a terrifying phrase, especially if you live in abject poverty. What the Christian Coalition did was they went door to door. They found communities, particularly white communities who were middle class, working class, and they convinced them that everything wrong in their society was wrong because of government, and everything right would be turned around by God. When you've got God versus government, God's going to win, and that's what they did. And so they convinced an entire generation that the solution. It's sort of in the black community we call it the prosperity church. Their prosperity church was being against government and for these hyper-conservative evangelical churches. Now, I'm the daughter of two ministers, so I get it. The reality is that the progressive side has essentially had very high-level conversations of intellect and have had very few direct conversations about values. Poor people don't hate rich people. They just want to be rich too. But if you talk about it in the wrong way, you're not going to convince people that you can help. We also, I think, as Democrats have been progressives have been too tied to what we've done, and we refuse to acknowledge that there may be some mistakes. So we sort of cling to the New Deal and to LBJ's policies, and rightly so, but we are afraid to admit that there were some flaws because we think if we admit that there was any problem, it's going to be taken away. Instead of doing that, having a conversation with a mother who's been on welfare to ask her what could help you move. The progressive policies have to start to reflect the values of the people we're dealing with, but it has to be as intensive and speak as much to the soul of the people we're reaching out to as the Christian Coalition did.
And I also think you have to push back on traditional wedge issues. I mean, let's talk about choice. Let's talk about being pro-life or being choice. I mean, Latinos in Texas or voters for that matter. I mean, they are not pro-conception. They are pro-life. And no one ever talks about the consistent ethic of life. When you talk to families about, okay, it's not just about having a child and bringing a child to be born into this world. It's also about putting clothes on their back. It's also about putting food in their mouth. It's about having a healthcare system that'll sustain them. It's about giving them opportunities in school, giving them opportunities in life. See, Republicans don't talk about that. They talk about this narrow definition of what it is to define life. We need to be very clear and consistent on it. And so, and I would also challenge back and say that it's not really our job to say that we have better ideas. It's our job to show that the ideas that the other team has are really bad. You take a Republican Party platform in Texas that says English is the official language of this country. Children that come to this country through no fault of their own shouldn't be entitled to in-state tuition. We should not have a pre-K education program. We should not have health care. I mean, let them explain that. If you're window shopping and you're looking at the menu of a restaurant and that is what you're serving, not very many Latinos are going to eat there. And so quite frankly, it's our job to point those out and amplify that, and that's what we should be talking about, and not try to run from these wedge issues because we're fearful that Hispanics are naturally pro-life and that's it, and because they're not.
I think we need to start looking at our constituency as voters. We think about, the tendency has been to think about groups as Latinos, blacks, but it's really a question of these are voters, these are people who are living their lives in the United States and who care about issues that have a great deal in common and essentially support what we would call a progressive agenda. Because the progressive agenda, I would contend, is a working family agenda, right? So whether it's questions about labor and workers' rights, workers' protections, making sure that education is solidly there for people regardless of race and class and what neighborhood you live in, whatnot. Those are the issues that people care about. And I think reconceptualizing who is the base of the Democratic Party, who is the majority of voters in the United States, by doing that, I think we sort of are able to connect with people in a different way. Because I don't think when somebody calls my mother's house that she's thinking, oh, they're calling me because I'm a Mexican American. She thinks they're calling her because she's the wife of a person who served 35 years in the U.S. military. She's the mother who's raised 4 children and gotten them through Texas public schools some way or another, and dealing with helping her cousin figure out how to access healthcare, right? Those are the things that really matter to a person. And when we talk to them and design programs from the sort of campaign and operative side, in a way that really is connecting and creating that thread across the different groups and actually building a coalition, as opposed to treating people as though they live in silos, as though when they call my mom, she's not a woman who has views on choice, but she's a Mexican-American, or she's an elderly person, whatever. People's lives are not lived in silos, and our work, I think, really has to be about integrating that and making that actually a part of, it already is a reality of life in the U.S., and we have to treat our voters in a way that really reflects our understanding of that. And the fact that the U.S. we have this very simplistic model for the Democratic Party of who our voters are, and it's way outdated. It's time to move on from that and actually change many of our own practices, where we invest resources, how we think about designing the messages that connect people in those ways.
What can we do to move beyond transactional electioneering?
I think it's, the easy answer is it's long-term, sustained, engagement. I think that it's, like Stacey said, and the real work begins the day after the election to make sure that folks are staying engaged in their government. But in a state like Texas, where you have the highest concentration of minority population, they're usually in districts that are decided in primary elections. And so coming up with engagement strategies to make sure that they are running full term, it's almost as if, I hate to say this because I know somebody's taping, but it's almost like you have to get every minority member of the state legislature a general election opponent if you want to start having a long-term engagement strategy. I'd lose my leadership post if they heard that, but that is true. If my colleagues worked as hard in November as they do in March, it certainly could start that long-term engagement opportunity.
Any other additions? Any other comments?
He's right.
Ditto. And we have a question from the floor.
Luis Garnacosta from Brooklyn. Many activists for social justice of color have major commitments to environmental justice, to educational reform, to affordable housing, and other major concerns in our community. But we don't think it's a worthy act to walk around with a petition and try to get someone on a ballot. We are suspicious of politicians. And yet the very people that we need to make this happen is those activists who move our communities. So how do we engage them? How do we change this picture so that our vanguard leaders in our community, people that are moving major issues, really engage in the electoral process?
Of ways. One thing that we've done in the House caucus, as leader, our rule is we don't play in primaries. Primaries are a time for the activists to pick who they want. And that's an important dynamic, because when the party picks its people, the party's going to pick it's going to pick people that may or may not reflect the values of the community. This cycle, we have 3 folks from labor who are on our ballot. A pipe fitter, a teamster, and someone in the building trades. That's important, because if you want activists to understand and to believe, they need to see their own faces. It's similar to what Trey said about having someone who looks like you knocking on your door. It's also having someone who believes like you talking about why this matters. But the second part is we have to remember that being a politician is a job. And it's a job that if you do your job, you should get to keep it, and if you don't do your job, you should lose it. I'm in an election year, and luckily I'm unopposed, but I mean it very sincerely. I should not get to keep this job if I'm not doing the job. And one of the roles of an activist is not simply to get people elected, but to hold us accountable every single day. Politics is the only job that you can have where you only get evaluated every 2 or 4 years by a very small percentage of the people who actually evaluate you. And really, the best way to keep your job is mediocrity. It's like, how many of you have seen Office Space? Essentially, you just want to stay at that desk and get moved over enough. If you don't do anything that if they can't figure out why they need to get rid of you, you usually get to stay. Mediocrity is the best way to keep your job as a politician. And so for the activist community, it is taking ownership of the people that they hire. And if we aren't willing to do the work, get rid of us, but more importantly, put your own person on the ballot. In Georgia, we don't require petitions. You just have to be willing to pay $400. That's not a lot to have to pay to get your name and, more importantly, your ideas into the ether.
I do play in primary politics because I'm in a foxhole, and I want to know who I'm in the foxhole with. I don't want to get shot by one of my own teammates. And so, but I think too, I think we have to be a little selfless about this. I think that the best return we can get on our political investments is to ask people for something without having an expectation in return. So in other words, we should really have